Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp, and I'm the Executive Editor for Dataversity. We'd like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Unlock Business Value Through Document and Content Management. This year's December edition in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken, brought to you in partnership with Data Blueprint. Now let me give the floor to Megan Jacobs, the webinar organizer from Data Blueprint, to introduce the speaker and today's webinar. Megan.
Thanks, Shannon. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Megan Jacobs, and I'm the webinar coordinator here at Data Blueprint. We are pleased that you found the time to join us for today's webinar on Unlock Business Value Through Document and Content Management. As always, a big thank you goes out to Shannon and Dataversity for hosting us. We'll get started in just a few moments after I let you know about some housekeeping items and introduce your presenter. We have a 1 hour presentation followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. We'll try to answer as many questions as time allows, but feel free to submit questions as they come up throughout the session. To answer the top 2 most commonly asked questions, yes, you will receive an email with links to download today's materials and any other information requests during the session within the next 2 business days. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We set up the hashtag DataEd on Twitter, so if you're logged on, feel free to use it in your tweets and submit your questions and comments that way. We'll keep an eye on the Twitter feed, and we'll include answers to those questions in our post-session email. Now, let me introduce you to our presenter. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. Peter is also the founding director of Data Blueprint. He has written dozens of articles and 8 books. The most recent is Monetizing Data Management. Peter's experience with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his and Data Blueprint's expertise. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, and the Commonwealth of Virginia and Walmart. He often appears at conferences and is constantly traveling. Peter, where are you headed this week?
So, Megan, this week, it's my first trip to India, so I'm blasting off on that and be back just in time for the holidays here. But I'm looking forward to my first visit to that part of the world. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Shannon. And today our topic is talking about how we can get some business value out of document and content management. And I'll sort of set the tone in a minute. Those of you that are regular attendees know that we spend the first few minutes of each hour reviewing this and placing this material in context. So what we're going to talk about today is the data management overview that I always give. Then we'll dive into what is document and content management and why is it important. And then we'll talk about planning and implementing these as a program, look at some specific levels of control, a couple of additional considerations getting us to some content management building blocks. We'll finish up at the top of the hour with some guiding principles, and as always, look forward to your question and answer sessions as we go through this. The first part of this, again, is the data management overview, which is just to say that we're not doing this in a vacuum. We are part of a larger society. This is my last month as president of DAMA International. So I'll move to past president in January, and my good friend and colleague Sue Hyans will be taking over the reins of the organization in January. The idea here is, of course, that DAMA International has codified and made formal a body of knowledge surrounding this area of data management, which is not a very well-known outside of our professional circle area. So we now have something that we can talk about specifically, and this icon that I have on the screen here for you talks about it. And you'll notice that data and content management is right down at about 7, 8 o'clock on the wheel here, if you will, one of the recognized areas within this. Again, we have about 40 chapters organized around the world, and it's the idea that if you don't have something well-known, people don't know what they don't know. And so what we're trying to do is bring this out to the rest of IT and, more importantly, make DAMA members valued in the eyes of their employers. In addition to these functions that we've talked about here, we also have the idea that these don't take place in a vacuum, and that if we rely exclusively on technology, it tends not to work. So we have to bring into the picture as well organization and culture, the specific activities, goals and principles, deliverables, roles and responsibilities, as well as the technologies that go into this. If you want to get a copy of this DIMBOK, as we call it, just enter DAMA DIMBOK at the Amazon search engine, and it'll pull us right up there on that. And the goal of this is to help increase the number of certified data management professionals that we have worldwide. About 1,600 of you right at the moment. It's in partnership with the ICCP, the Institute for the Certification of Computing Professionals. And the set of exams focuses in on a data management core, an IT core, and then a specialization exam that you can pick. And one of those exam areas might happen to be data and content management. So we'd love to get some feedback as to how helpful these sessions have been getting you towards that particular goal. Now, when we talk about data management, most people don't conjure up this particular picture, but this is the one that we've been using for years and years. It's a complex IDEF model that shows really how the 5 data management practices areas need to interrelate to each other. We show this actually as the management version, and I'll simplify it here now for you. The 5 areas are to, in fact, manage the data coherently, to try and make sure that we are all singing off of the same piece of paper. What we see in most organizations, particularly from a document and content management perspective, is that it's handled rather more at the department or work group level rather than at the organization level. So if good people are trying to do the right thing, but they don't realize that others in the organization are also trying to do this, you end up losing the opportunity for a synergistic combination there in the first area, which is called data program management. The second one is called organizational data integration, and this is the idea that these documents and content management are going to be shared across boundaries, whether it is between 2 departments in your organization, whether it's between 2 technical programs, an ERP, for example, and a transactional system that may be feeding information to the ERP, or whether it's between your organization and your business partners. You are sharing some of this data, and some of it occurs in content. In fact, quite a lot of it occurs in content and data document management as we do this. And again, most of this sharing occurs in an unconstrained, ungoverned environment. It's probably not the best way to have it happen. Another thing that we've discovered over the years is that if we assign the responsibility for managing the functions that I'm talking about here now, whether it's, again, document and content management or data management as a whole, if we rely on everybody to do their level best, they tend to assume it's somebody else's actual responsibility. So the idea behind stewardship is making it personal. We have to make sure that it says, Peter, your next raise depends on this particular activity. And so if we don't have that occur, it won't occur. So we make it personal, and the minute it says my name on it and my name is responsible for making sure that the document and content management activities are performed better next year than they were this year, I'll be paying a lot more attention to it. Or fourth area is data development. This is the idea of engineering data delivery systems. For the most part, this has meant to people building relational database management systems. Fortunately or not, document management systems tend to work on a little different technology. They can work very well with relational database management systems, but there are some other options here. And fortunately or not, your IT people have only probably been notionally introduced to them. The curriculums in this country and worldwide do not incorporate this material into them, so they have to go somewhere else in order to gain access to this type of information. So again, our 4th data management function is engineering data delivery systems, and our 5th function is support operations, which is making sure that the data is available to people when they need it and that it is fit for use at that time. So again, just to review, our overall chart here looks like this. We don't show that to management. We show them the simple version of data program coordination, managing the data coherently, organizational data integration, sharing data across boundaries, data stewardship, assigning responsibilities for it, data development, engineering data delivery systems, and data support operations, making sure that data is available and fit for use in the organizations. I fleshed out that same diagram with a little bit more in orange in there just to give you an idea of some of the inputs and outputs to the various boxes are. And you can see here now is the overview of the document and content management chapter of the DMBOK, also presented in a very similar format. You'll notice it is also an input activity or process and output diagram here. The inputs include text, reports, spreadsheets, email, messages, faxes, voicemail. The list goes on and on forever. And the activities are managing the documents and records and managing the content, which we'll talk about in the rest of this hour. And the deliverables are things we'll talk about in terms of the outputs. You'll see there's some goals on top. Each of the chapters in the DMBOK is organized in this fashion. And again, we hope that you find that as a useful document. So now that we've grounded ourselves in what we mean by data management, let's talk specifically about document and content management and look at why it's important. And the first one of those leads to a question that we ask people a lot of times, which is that how much do the experts consider that unstructured, or what I prefer to refer to as non-tabular data management relative to our standard piece? So if we take a step back and say that, standard tabular data, think of it as rows and columns in a spreadsheet, or again the relational database management paradigm, that's tabular. We tend to hear the term bandied about quite a bit, unstructured data. We'll come back to it several times in this webinar as well. It really, if you think about it, the term unstructured data means that it couldn't be structured. That's the very definition of it. So a lot of these companies and seminars and things will talk to you about how to take structured data and make it into how to take unstructured data and make it into structured data. Again, by definition, unstructured data couldn't have that happen to them. But we do like to refer to it as tabular and non-tabular, so I'll be doing that largely in this presentation. And the question for you all is, how much is the volume challenge in there? In other words, is one non-tabular bigger than tabular, or tabular bigger than non-tabular? Well, I've given you a little clue here with the piece where I've said that the non-tabular challenge is bigger. The question is, are they the same size, 2x, 4x, or 10x larger than this? So let's give you guys a minute here and see what you all think, and then we'll move on with the presentation. So, Megan?
All right, we've got about 10 seconds left, and getting some answers in. Give it a few more seconds here.
You'll have to tell me what the majority are saying here, since I don't see that on my screen here.
Sure. All right, so the results are in. Let me see here. It looks like, let's see here. Most responded with D.
D, 10x. Well, they were real close. The answer, according to the, quote, experts, is 5x, but nevertheless, it's still a lot more. So we, if you think about it, spend a lot of our time and effort managing this tabular data domain. And the external portion of this, the non-tabular, is about 5 times that when we look at it. And if you think about it, again, here's a structured and unstructured description of it, but nevertheless a still valuable picture. The structured data falls into the ERP transaction, somebody doing something in a purchase, somebody looking at an analytical application, coming up with an analysis of this. All this falls into our domain here of tabular data. The non-tabular data then are going to be the web documents, the video files, the product manuals, the wetware, the tribal knowledge, the stuff that's in our colleagues' heads, the email, the audio files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that does represent a good deal more data for most organizations than they would have had access to otherwise. And this is going to be a challenge for organizations as we move forward because of the volume and because of the non-tabular nature of it, which just makes it a bit messy. So let's get to a definition. Document and content management is defined by the DMBOK as the control over capture, storage, access, and use of data and information stored outside of relational databases. Now, that should actually read outside of traditional tabular data management systems, because we also can include hierarchical and network-type databases in there as well. in that this data would not fall into that traditionally. With big data, however, it does become interesting because Hadoop, in fact, does give you access to some non-tabular data capabilities as well. The focus of document and content management is looking at integrity and access. It's roughly equivalent to the data operations management for relational databases. If you think about it, somebody in your office may be responsible for producing documents for a meeting and pulling information together for that, making sure that they have access to these additional forms of information is absolutely critical for the organization. And again, while we can do it in programming from a database management perspective for the tabular data, the non-tabular is much beyond a purely operational focus. These areas overlap each other with talking about the need for governance, architecture, security, metadata, and data quality as well. And all of these, so none of these occur in a vacuum. There are two sub-functions within these. One is the document management, the idea that storage, inventory, and control over paper and electronic documents becomes important. And it encompasses the processes and technologies for controlling all of these documents, whether they're stored electronically or on paper. And then something that is not in a document form but is still content. So it's the idea that we can take this content and store it, publish it, and reuse it in a number of different ways. This topic also is referred to very often as enterprise content management, implying the scope is across the entire enterprise. And as I've said before, you'll see a lot of organizations with an enterprise content management initiative that they won't know they've already got some good basis in the organization for starting this. If you have a data governance organization, you can include this in the scope of the data governance activities and things like that. We'll come back to that a little bit more. I've already mentioned this, again, tabular or non-tabular data. It's, again, this document, file, graphic image, text report, something that hasn't been tagged or otherwise moved into a traditional records-oriented format. And that is a problem. A lot of different types of formats allow us to do this, and a lot more of the intelligence gathering is falling into these less structured formats that we have here. Again, just things like paper files and things like that as well are also going to come into it. Now, it's important to take a life cycle approach to these because especially for significant documents in the organization, not having access to them is a very big challenge. So we need to put our hands on this. We need to think about these like personnel records or electronic medical records and things like that. Everything in healthcare, in fact, has been focused around this concept of records management. So the idea here is that these records can be physical or electronic or sometimes a combination of both. Somebody might have an X-ray that they're looking at for a patient and then dictate a series of verbal requirements or instructions to the nursing staff, to people who are doing further or subsequent analysis on this, or maybe making notes for the next day's surgery on this. Again, we see these idea here that the growth in these areas, and I don't have to tell you all this because you see it in your inbox for your electronic mail. There are some very, very significant things that are happening there, and none of it is making any of this stuff easier. So we have a lot of work cut out for us as a profession, and there are some compliance and regulations that we have to pay attention to in these areas. Again, Sarbanes-Oxley is just the starting point. E-discovery amendments, we're going to come back to that, but e-discovery in particular is a bit that talks about legal aspects of this. And one of the things that they've done is that they've made lawyers more responsible. Lawyers are no longer allowed to simply say, I passed that request to the technical staff and it's their responsibility. They're actually imposing that responsibility on lawyers. This is actually a good hook for you. By the way, Canada Bill 198, very similar type purpose in there as well. But when you start to look at this and try to figure out how to get people behind a project like this, if you go to your corporate counsel and talk to them about electronic discovery and the challenges that they have with that area, you'll have a very interesting conversation with them and find, in this case, a lot more support for the types of activities that you're helping the organization to move towards. And one of my favorite examples in this is a $1.5 billion email. This is this trial that occurred early on in the middle example here, Perlman versus Morgan Stanley, where Morgan Stanley was finding things that were, again, they were tried. They were told to produce all of the electronic email pertaining to a particular subject or trial or something, and that the judge in the case that was a precedent here instructed the jury that it could assume that the missing information was probably damaging. In other words, they can't find it because they don't want to find it. That's a really harsh thing to have said. And I mentioned this in the previous slide. The lawyers now must know what is known. So in other words, the lawyers can't say, well, the IT people have this responsibility. The lawyers are actually going to have this responsibility. And that the data must be delivered in these native formats and then secured appropriately. And in one case, Morgan Stanley found this tape that had an email on there. So for a single email, they were fined $604 million in compensatory and $850 million in punitive damages. So that's $1.5 billion in this case for a single email around this. So if this isn't important for your organization, like I said, go talk to the lawyers in your organization, your corporate counsel, and they will absolutely tell you how much of a problem it is. Let's turn now to planning and implementing document content management. What it really comes up to is that we have a cycle that we need to do, which is to identify the newly created documents and records that are going to be significant. And again, you want to make sure that there's two types of significance. The first type is things that you're supposed to hold by law. So again, it may be a document of record or something like that. So you as the data management professionals are going to have to determine what is material, what is significant to that, and what is not. But nevertheless, you identify them. Then you create, approve, and enforce document record policies. So if it's a mortgage document, you might identify it as a significant piece, and you might say we need some specific pieces of guidance on how to manage this particular mortgage application. Now, I was doing some work for one of the TARP banks back in 2008 as the economy was imploding around this, and I was shown a room at one point where they had piles and piles of files. And I said, what are these? And they said, this is our ninja loan pile. Of course, most of you know what that was, the no job, no income loans. They knew they weren't going to have a lot of success with these, and so they were consequently putting them in a low priority. Now, that particular practice came back to bite the bank because later on when they tried to foreclose on some of these properties, they couldn't produce the original documents that they were supposed to produce. And because they couldn't prove that they had actually title to them, and that created a big problem for this particular bank. Again, our next way of moving on this is to classify the documents and records, try and find out what sort of shape they're in. Are they, again, organizational critical, or are they, something that anybody can have access to? Then let's talk about what our retention policy is. How long should these various classifications of documents do? Now, I hope some of you are seeing here some parallels between our examples in the security world as well. This is role-based document management, the same way as we prefer to do role-based security as we're doing security here as well. Then, of course, we have a storage function. We're going to place these records someplace and make sure that people can gain access to them when they need to and not when they're not supposed to. We then need to retrieve and circulate them. In the instance of this foreclosure thing, they need to be able to go back and find that particular policy with the original signature on it so they can prove to the judge that they have it, and then preserve and or dispose of that so that we have a life cycle that completely tells us what we're doing all the way through the life cycle, and that we have an expectation that, more importantly, everybody has an expectation for how these are going to go through. Let's talk about another aspect of this as well. Again, different levels of the document's life cycle. What we're really talking about here is creation or receipt of something, the organization for retrieval of that information, the distribution of that information, and then the archiving or distribution of the documents in that sense. So again, we need to develop these classification and indexing systems. Sometimes when you tell people that they have to create a taxonomy, they get a little scared. Turns out there are lots of existing taxonomies out there that you can look to, and one of the things that would be a good place to look to is open and linked data. Both of these areas have developed lots and lots of areas around there so that you can use them as starting places, so that you do not need to start from an absolute ground zero on these efforts. Again, for implementation of this, we need to make sure that these things can be indexed. Again, it may involve transcribing it. It may use Adobe Acrobat to actually turn a blob, if you will, into some text. This is what most people are thinking of when they talk about the transformation between non-tabular and tabular data. It can go way beyond that as well. A typical repository is going to have sort of a check-in, check-out type feature, particularly when you're looking at a collaboration scenario or that you're looking at a situation of making sure you have a chain of evidence. So the document storage components include this document management, and that the documents should be categorized for retrieval so we can organize them in the way in which they're going to be needed later on. Again, if this bank had known that they were going to be foreclosing on so many of those ninja loans, I can guarantee you they would not have would not have managed these things by throwing literally a bunch of piles into a room, piles of files into a room, and more importantly, they certainly wouldn't be showing it to outsiders on that as well. Again, the reports can be delivered through a number of tools, printers, et cetera, and that many of these document management systems allow you to deal with this information in its multi-dimensional formats as you take a look at this on this. So let's talk about levels of control now that we're looking at, and really the key here is that most of these levels of control can be related back to a couple of simple principles around this. Again, formal control is the most rigid. It requires formal change initiation and an evaluation of the potential impact of that change, as well as a decision by some sort of change authority. Again, there's a full status accounting and implementation of this to all the various stakeholders who are involved in this. Then there's a revision component, which is less formal and just says, hey, major things have happened, but we're putting it out. Again, you're probably not going to be consulted. And then finally, custody, which is the least rigid, least formal, and really requires just a safe storage and a means of retrieval on this. And let's look specifically then around the level of criticality. So something that is much more critical would be managed towards the top level, and something that is less critical would be managed towards the bottom there. Again, you can see the implications for the roles-based system in there. Here's a sample list of some of these things that you could look at. Again, agenda items for board meetings or something might be in a revision category, whereas the action items might be in a revision category. The actual agendas might be for custody. But when we talk about a budget, budget authority might be very formal. So how did these numbers get changed? How do we move back and forth between what we had and what we are going to have? Now, the idea of determining these various levels of control is another component here as well. And I should have mentioned the ANSI standard 859, which is something that you can go back to and use as a reference here, because it also talks about the determination of the level of control. You also have to work in the cost of providing and updating the asset. What is the project impact? What are the other consequences when we change to the enterprise or to the project? The need to reuse and the maintenance of a history of that change. And all of these sets of guidance are available in 859, which will give you access to a whole lot better types of pieces rather than having to make it all up yourself. So there's a lot of history in this field, a lot of areas. These are just some of the starting points that you should take a look at in there. So when we look at these things, I've having a major storm on the East Coast right now. I don't think there's any data centers that are threatened right at the moment, but I've certainly been with organizations that have had data centers threatened. And, people have to look and say, well, what are the needs within here for your organization to be able to back up and recover all of this type of information? One of the groups I work with has its data center literally a mile apart from the other site. They've determined that for this organization, if something bad happens to this organization, something bad's probably going to happen to the backup and recovery site, and having a mile difference is not going to be important to them. I've had other organizations where they maintain these things states apart. So one part will be in one state and one part will be in a different state, separated by a number of miles, hoping that the geographic variation will allow them to protect this. The point is, if you just let IT people make this decision and you don't have the business involved with it, the IT person may make the wrong decision based on the wrong perception of the business value of these documents. So appointing a documents or records manager over top of this that has a good picture, that is able to bring this voice to the table and talk about it in the general context of everything else, is useful. And that should be done in context of a continuity plan. We also call them disaster recovery, et cetera, et cetera. Little quick story here on this. Nobody really likes to plan for disasters. And in IT in particular, we had a very poor record. In fact, if Osama bin Laden had been able to launch his disastrous attack on New York City a couple of years prior to 2001, we may not have recovered quite as well, because it was around the end of the 90s, the beginning of 2000s, where we made the responsibility for implementation of a business continuity plan or disaster recovery plan the exclusive and personal responsibility of a chief information officer. Up to that point, it had been somebody else's plan, and that would have been maybe more or maybe less useful in there. But when we made it and said, CIOs, your responsibility, it is your personal responsibility to make sure these things happen, then we got a lot more people paying attention to this, and consequently the impact of the horrible tragedy on 9/11 was much lessened compared to what it could have been had we not been as good at doing this type of disaster recovery. Again, this absolutely mandates that you have an identification of what are considered to be vital organizational records. If you don't know which ones are important and just want to save all of them, it's probably not going to work. Then you can develop plans for protection and recovery of these, and most importantly, maintenance of these plans. One of the other groups we worked with in a backup and recovery plan around their data and content management, and it was a particularly valuable exercise, was that this particular organization we were working with were located miles and miles from any water that would flood. And they just assumed that flood was not going to be a part of what they were going to have to deal with on this. And yet we had a tropical storm come to town and dump 14 inches of rain in an afternoon on this particular organization and the region. And the sewer system backed up, and it came up through the bottom of the floor and flooded their data centers out because the sewer system was incapable of handling this much water on this. So again, things can bite you. You don't know necessarily where or when or how, and you do have to pay attention to them as well. So again, this retention and disposition program is slightly different now from the disaster recovery. This is simply to say that if somebody's been in your system for a while, you should have a way of sunsetting that particular record. So how long do we want to maintain? What period of time do we have to maintain a check that a person wrote for a bank to pay for a purchase? Again, it's going to be different from every organization, but if we don't formally maintain it, the answer to retaining everything is probably not the right answer. On the other hand, it's probably also not keep it for a day. So somewhere between the two of those is where people need to do it. There probably needs to be a first primary, if you will, and a secondary storage facility. So maybe the checks that haven't been accessed for 10 years or more can be put into, in this instance, cardboard boxes. Again, I'm certainly not recommending that as a way to go. in order to do that. And most importantly of all of this, again, we've defined the amount of time the records need to be maintained. We've defined when they're not active and can be maintained in secondary storage. But we also need to look specifically at how processes interact with those records so that we can then set schedules and make sure that there's a routine process for going through and purging data. Again, many of you have limits on the size of your inbox, whether it's imposed by Google or by a corporate standard or whatever, and you have to spend some amount of your time making sure that your mailboxes do not exceed a certain level. Otherwise, you end up with the inability to use your mailboxes as you come out of that process. So let's look at another specific example here. Again, maybe an audit type of context where somebody has gone through and said, well, how broad are your policies? Are they in fact comprehensive enough for people to go through and understand what goes on? So again, it's an inventory, right? Where's the location that we're maintaining these documents and records? And what type of storage areas do we have? Again, are they in the basement, which may be perfectly good, although after the example that I gave you a few minutes ago, we may decide that the basement isn't, in fact, the best place to maintain these things. Are the records reliable and accurate? Again, spot checks will help out with that to give some ideas around that. Classification and indexing schemes. Do you maintain, again, information that everybody knows? One of the groups I worked with was an engineering group, and they have done some really wonderful things in their organization, but they also had something that they called the term bank. It was a wonderful example of a content management system that maintained some of the vocabulary that the engineers used. And when you were in a meeting, if you used a term that they thought should be in the term bank, the corporate culture was such that everybody got on their computers and looked up to see whether the term was in the term bank. And if it wasn't there, they had a process that they knew to submit so that it would get submitted and then evaluated for potential inclusion in that term bank. This led to the development of the classification and indexing schemes for the organization, which meant that their access and retrieval was much, much easier. Now, their retention process was different. They were engineers, and they liked to keep everything, so they tried very hard to keep it all. They didn't really use disposition methods. They did have security and confidentiality. In fact, myself and a colleague got in trouble for taking a picture of one of their artifacts in the building. We couldn't figure out how to describe it, so we figured we'd take a picture of it. And instantly their security people were on us and saying, why are you taking a picture of our cruiser collector on this? Finally, again, just understanding of this as a high-level component in here. So when we look at this, you want to think of it as an audit, although I wouldn't use that term because it tends to scare people, but it describes the drivers of document management. It describes the process of gathering the how, the why, the how, and then reports on the outcomes so that people can develop plans of action and start to address the things that they have had some challenges with around that area. All right, let's look at the content management building blocks then. Here again, the goal is, and these are things that you want to think about for the charter of your document content management initiative here. You want to safeguard and ensure the availability of these data assets that are stored in this non-tabular format to make sure that you have effective and efficient retrieval and use of these pieces of information. These should complement your existing data management practices. You, of course, want to comply with the legal obligations and customer expectations. You want to ensure the business continuity through the retention, recovery, and conversion, and control document storage operating costs. If you've ever had to work in the legal environment, one of the areas that people have the most trouble with is, in fact, making sure that they are able to make these costs at a reasonable level, whatever reasonable is for that particular organization. So again, goals and principles, if you work these into your charter, get your charter approved, then you'll have a set of authority that you can use to manage this. So what are we looking at? Well, from a document and records management perspective, you're going to plan for managing the documents and records. You're going to look at backup and recovery. You're going to look at retention and disposal. You're going to look at audits. You're going to look at implementation of these systems to make sure that they fit within here. And then for content management as well, which is a little looser, you're going to look at the specifics of what your vocabulary should be. Now, if the word taxonomy scares people, substitute the word vocabulary in there. Again, content metadata around that, access and retrieval, and finally, quality is going to be afforded in there as well because it is a related topic. So when we look at these deliverables out of our content management, we first of all are more likely going to be, happily or not, dealing with e-discovery records. Next, we're going to be looking at outgoing letters and emails, policies and procedures, audit trails, logs, minute meetings, reports, memoranda, documents and financial report, and record in different formats here. I've got several companies that are actually using executives, interviews with executives, and as they do this, these are archived as well because they do constitute statements to the public around this. So when we look at the various roles and responsibilities here, first of all employees end up spending time here, but we won't get everybody's attention. So let's start with the data stewards and the data management professionals. If you have a designated records management staff, it's a good place to go. You can expand from there into other IT professionals and eventually working your way up to the CIO level. Possibly some organizations are adopting a chief knowledge officer concept. And again, if you've got one of those, it's a good way to take a look. Similarly, you have suppliers being employees and external parties, and finally the business and the IT users are consumers. But your government and regulatory agencies are also consumers in here. Senior management, external customers are also going to pay attention to these. And I want to drive home a particular point here because what you'll see from the regulatory perspective is something that can help you with strategy. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you a little bit about this because we've seen this happen over and over for organizations on this. And I'll get to this on the next slide here as well. So to make sure we tie the two together, again, there are lots and lots of data management and enterprise content management technologies. These things will store the documents, but they also require you to use Office productivity tools, and by this most people understand it to mean Microsoft Office suite of tools. There are record management tools, there are XML development tools, collaboration tools, the internet email systems, and image and workflow management tools. All of these things come together, and interestingly enough, though, what happens in many, many instances around this is that the one word comes up, and it's SharePoint. So I'm sure we'll get a couple questions on SharePoint. And SharePoint is, in fact, a terrific case study for us to look at this entire process. Now, SharePoint is a wonderful set of technologies developed by Microsoft to address some of the things that we've talked about in today's seminar here. Microsoft actually sells it for a very low price point, so it's a very affordable technology. And what has happened with most of the organizations around this is exactly the opposite of what Microsoft wanted to do. So I'm going to jump ahead to a different slide here for a moment and just talk about this in this context, which is our overview here that we've been talking about as well. Now, SharePoint as a non-tabular document management system by itself as a technology works extremely well. Microsoft programming is not flawed. It functions as it's supposed to. However, Microsoft will be the very first people to tell you that if you implement SharePoint as a document management system content management system without governance and quality around it, you end up with a pile of stuff in SharePoint and a bunch of URLs and nobody really able to make sense out of it. Now, this would have been a great polling question that we could have asked, and how many of you all have SharePoint and how many of you think it's just a mess that's out there? And I'm willing to bet a large number of you would do that. It's not SharePoint's fault. It's not Microsoft's fault. What it is that the inputs that have been put into SharePoint, the text documents, the reports, the email, the instant messages, the fax, the voicemail, the images, the videos, the audio recordings, the paper printed files, the microfiche, the graphics, everything that goes into this needs to be vetted. It needs to be governed. The people who put it there, the suppliers, the employees, the external parties who are loading this information up, need to understand that they are part of a larger document and content management process. And within that life cycle, there are certain points where the documents should be put in there and certain points where it should not be put in there. Again, it's just a very, very straightforward process. And Microsoft has done a terrific job of making sure that you can tag these things. So you'll see this at the operating system level, both in Windows and Macintosh and other areas where you can tag documents with project names, and then it will start to draw those projects together for you in the SharePoint environment. Now, again, in SharePoint, if you put it up without a plan for managing your documents and records, without a plan for implementing the systems for the acquisition, storage, access, and security controls, you will end up with just a mess, and that's what most SharePoint installations have turned into. It's pretty easy to back up and recover them because you can simply back up the entire SharePoint environment. It's much more difficult to retain and dispose of these documents and records, and it's practically impossible to audit them from most perspectives. So these are really problems. And again, if we're looking at it from a technological perspective, and again, just not to pick on SharePoint, but most of you are familiar with it, what you'll see is that people stick stuff out there and it doesn't have any true meaning. There may be 6 or 10 versions of different documents people working on in parallel. They don't use the check-in and check-out perspectives on it, so it becomes very, very difficult to orderly move this way through the document lifecycle. So what most organizations have done is that they've sort of backed up a little bit and said, well, we'll filter the documents going to the next version of SharePoint as we move it forward. And anything that hasn't been looked at for 5 years or that doesn't have proper tagging or something along those lines, we'll put in a secondary storage, as we talked about earlier, and the stuff that will remain in SharePoint will be of primary storage on this. Because the technology alone can't help you get rid of the complexity, the clutter, the absolute chaos that exists in some organizations because they have not implemented these according to good document and content management principles. Now, when we talk about unlocking business value, this becomes very important because we think of business value as having 2 dimensions. One dimension is making it as cheap as possible to respond to routine or regulatory issues. If we know we're going to be having to respond to certain types of legal actions or regulatory reporting requirements, then we can set up not just the document storage technology, but the document management process. And again, if there's been an area that we've failed as an industry in the past, is that we've thought that by buying technology, it would help us to comply with it. On the other hand, I'm sure many of you have heard it's in SharePoint. Now, some of you probably have very well-managed SharePoint environments and are staring incredibly at your screen and saying, Peter, what are you talking about? SharePoint's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And for your organization, I applaud you that you've, in fact, put in place the governance controls, the entire document and content management principles that need to be placed in order to do this. On the other hand, I can tell you 9 out of 10 organizations have not done this. They do not have the policies and procedures in place. And so when we look at these around the area of what are we trying to do from a document and content management perspective, it becomes very, very difficult for organizations to understand this. Now, this is not an advertisement for SharePoint. SharePoint is a wonderful technology and it works very, very well. It may or may not be appropriate for your organizational needs. So that said, go back here again, try and avoid the challenges that Microsoft has clearly implemented with SharePoint, and say, what do we need in the way of stored documents? What can we use as productivity tools, as records management tools that will help us in order to do this? You'll see a lot of workflow tool-based support that can help around this. If you're having trouble developing it yourself, XML can represent a very powerful set of technologies to employ. XML, as you may or may not be aware of, is the extensible markup language, which is a vocabulary for defining organizational vocabularies. So you can use the power of XML to incorporate into your tools. As another seminar that I do on XML in particular and document management. If you have questions about that, we may be able to refer you to some of those pieces as well. Finally, the Internet itself, of course, actually has a wealth of places for you to get started in terms of organizational technologies and terminologies. And I worked with a group over the last couple of years called WAND Inc., WANDINC, and they have done some very, very good work in developing industry-specific taxonomies. And they'd be happy to talk to you about providing a starter set so that you don't have to start off with that proverbial blank piece of paper that scares you-know-what out of everybody else. So that's really it for technologies around here. Let's move on, and we've just got a couple more topics before we get back to the beginning of the hour. And what we're going to talk about here are the guiding principles, which is to say that unless everybody in the organization starts to pay attention to this, and I'll go back to my SharePoint example. If you have one person in the organization that, well, let's just say that the organization says, if you're going to stick something in SharePoint in a way that it's going to be accessible and part of our document management lifecycle that we're going to use, then you must agree to stick in the relevant keywords, fill out the permissions tab, if you will, on the Word document, the PowerPoint slides that you have, the spreadsheets that you're using, whatever it is that you decide the governance should be. So we're going to assume that everybody has to put their name and write a short little sentence or two that says what's the purpose of this document, how is it used in the organization, how does it fit in with our established policies and procedures. If you have everybody that says they're going to do that and then one person doesn't, you still can end up with a mess because your stuff will be findable and their stuff will be more difficult to locate because we are not experts at handling these records. Again, most of you have not been trained. Library science does give you a bit of work towards that, a bit of knowledge, skills, and ability. So if you have a library scientist in your organization, you might want to consult them and actually defer to them in terms of how we should be implementing policy and planning. And even if you don't have those access to them, business stewards should understand that they are not responsible for just the tabular information in the organization, but that their mission does include the non-tabular versions of this information. Because if we don't have the non-tabular pieces, again, it helps to these non-tabular pieces help to put the tabular pieces in context in here. So, again, heading towards the top of the hour here, the idea is that we do this to some degree pretty well with our tabular data. The banks tend, when you write a check or charge something on your charge account, to in fact charge your account accurately for that information with the right debits and the right credits. Document and content management is a bigger area by a factor of 5, and it is more complex. It tends to have hooks into the legal environment, which is the ability of the organization to comply with legal requirements in a cost-effective fashion. But it also has something to do with innovation. And this is the idea that as we find out things like customer relationship management, we will have internal information, but we might also include external information, where the last couple of salespeople who have called on that organization might have a series of notes or even verbal recordings of a phone conversation that they've had. We'll assume there's permission involved in there. And that this information, if it can't be integrated in with the rest of it, it just becomes useless and piles up. We have a word for it. We call this type of data rot. It is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And if we can't gain access to this information that we need to have in order to do this, then there's no ability for the organization to, in fact, come up with a good set of information that they need to have in order to address the challenge. So on one dimension, we have low cost, efficiency, and effectiveness. On another dimension, we have innovation. And if we have those two pieces, they are orthogonal to each other. They do not relate. Getting better at the cost effectiveness will help you to manage your goals, but it will not necessarily help you with the innovation. Being innovative around this can be hampered by lack of efficiency and effectiveness. So they do tend to work, and again, what we do is we take most organizations and say it's a crawl, walk, and then run stage, with crawling being where most organizations are, walking where most organizations would like to get to, making their compliance, the things that they must do, as efficient and effective as possible, and then running being the creative activity of how are we going to take this overall document, content, and management perspective and make it available so that we can, in fact, go out and grab the last 3 emails that people have written to our organization about us, or find out what the Twitter feed feels about it, or look at social media and see what people are posting on their Facebook sites and what they say about certain specific organizations, in fact, our own organization, if that's what we're trying to gain insight into. All of these things come together to represent an area that is vastly larger than anything most people have imagined around there. Again, all employees are going to be performing in this, stewards in particular, data management professionals to a lesser degree. To the degree that it's appropriate, the records management staff, other IT professionals will represent this and understand this as relevant in there. And all the way up again to our Chief Information and Knowledge Officer. I'm going to tell a quick little story here as we get closer to the top of the hour of how one organization used this particular process on this. It was an organization that was really devoted to a culture of heroics. They were very much sold on the idea that everybody would do everything for the organization. And they had a challenge at one point where it was an operational challenge. Some part of their technology environment went down, ceased to function. And when it did, they brought in actually pizza, as you might expect. They had cameras around where they were taking pictures and taking a quick interview with an employee who'd been up for 36 hours working on the problem, trying to get it resolved. In order to do this. And when we went back through the camera video footage that we had, we found out that, in fact, if they had put in place, in this case, a content management system that had access to it, we were able to piece together the cause of the failure, the technology failure, and relate it directly to poor content management practices in this organization. And the organization decided that maybe it would be better to not focus quite as much on the employee heroics, but instead focus more on employees' compliance with the types of things, because it turned out that the entire episode could have been avoided through good content management practices. And if the employee who was charged with that particular piece had, in fact, followed through and documented what they were supposed to, the data center failure would not have even occurred in the first place. So we're at the top of the hour. I'll leave you with that story here. As usual, we've included a series of references that we have in here that will help you get to some of the right types of materials in there. Here are the standards, in particular ANSI 859 that we talked about. There's some ISO references in there, and if your organization has not had to deal with e-discovery, consider yourselves extremely fortunate. But most organizations do have some form of e-discovery that they pay attention to, and so you may want to bone up on those areas there as well. With that, we're at the top of the hour, and we'll see what sort of questions that you all have on this. Let me just say, too, as we're finishing this up, Shannon, this is our 3rd year together of doing this, it's just an absolute pleasure to work with Dataversity, and Megan and I are just thrilled to continue this, and we have a whole series of exciting programs planned for the future, including the January seminar. We're going to do demystifying, and then we'll talk about February, a data-centric strategy and roadmap. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Megan, and let's see what sort of questions and answers you guys have. This was always a really fun part for us.
All righty. Thanks, Peter. That was a great presentation. And now it's time for the Q&A. Time for you all to ask your questions. So just click on the Q&A window. It's at the top of your screen, and you can submit your questions through that window. And I'll give it a minute here and see what you guys have to ask. All right, it looks like we had one come in. What resources are available to learn about taxonomy, creation and maintenance, and metadata assignment and collection standards are good practices?
So those are two particular pieces on there. The first one was taxonomy, and the second was metadata, Megan?
Yes.
Okay. So from a taxonomy perspective, I would definitely head back into the library literature. Library science literature. There's a lot of good materials in there. If you think about it, our entire system of how to pass knowledge on to people before the Internet was you went to a library because that's where the books were, and you went to a 3x5 index card because that told you what was in the books and where the books were located. So the library science people, and the Dublin Core in particular, have done a really fine job of organizing that from a taxonometric perspective. Now, if you want to go a little further than that and figure out how to use it for your organization, I'd really urge you to come to some of our DAMA meetings, because I've not seen much written up around that topic that I would recommend for the average listeners on that sort of thing. But what you'll find at our DAMA meetings, we have one coming up in April called Enterprise Data World. It's going to be in Austin, by the way, which is an awesome town to have a conference in. And the focus down there is that you have people who are really doing this stuff day in and day out. And we have birds of feather sessions and things like that around it in order to do it. Where another place I would point you to from the taxonometric perspective is to take a look at some of the linked data and open data type formats. When you look at what types of things people are doing under those rubrics, you'll find it. There's a great book, I can't remember what it was called, one of the early semantic web books in there. It wasn't Dave McCombs, which is the one I've got on the screen here, which is an excellent book on there. But the first 3 chapters were like, why can't you people just keep this information organized? And look what we could do if we could actually keep it organized for you. And it went through a very nice description of how that should be occurring. I think it was called the semantic web. I would jump over to Amazon and look at it, but I can't do that right at the moment in order to do that. Now, that's the taxonometric perspective, and for those of you that are not familiar with it, taxonomy is a way of describing things, and it's important that you use a formal taxonomy to describe things. I'll just give you my basic example on that, which is that if you have a car dealership, and the car dealership says, we're going to sell you a car by January 31st, but then they turn around and put that car on sale on February 1st, and we're still send out to all their customers the fact that your car that you bought last month is now cheaper than it was when you purchased it, you're probably not doing anybody a service. So the first set of organizing principles around customer that I always work with for organizations is to say never let anybody assume the word customer is going to be meaningful in your organization. It's not that it's an unmeaningful term, but it's more meaningful when you qualify it. And here's 2 qualifications that we need to put in place right away: current customer and potential customer. Our current customers are ones who have bought stuff from us recently, and our potential customers are people who have not purchased something recently. We would clearly want to tell our potential customers that we were putting things on sale and not tell our current customers that the thing that they bought last week is now being offered for less than they paid for it. Now, the importance of taxonomy is that they both go up to the concept of customer. Customer comes down into current customer and potential customer. But if we take it one step further than that, we may find, in fact, that the concept of ex-customer becomes a little bit more challenging for the organization. Is ex-customer a type of potential customer, or is ex-customer a type of current customer, or do we need a third piece in our organizational taxonomy there? I've gone on for a bit here answering that taxonometric question here. Let me move over and address the metadata question. I've got a couple books here on library science shown on the screen that are very, very good places to take a look at on this. The subject of metadata, of course, is data about data. We do an entire subject on this on the Dataversity Data Ed webinars that we do that comes up sometime in the next year. But the idea here around metadata is critical, and of course the taxonomy becomes part of your metadata in there. So when you're looking at metadata management, it's really important to figure out what is important metadata, just as we would consider the same thing with what is important documents, and again put them into categories. What I prefer people to do is not try to identify specific pieces of metadata, but in fact to decide whether we're going to expand or contract the scope of our metadata management practices around there. And again, there's some things that we've done there. As I mentioned earlier, we have done a specific webinar around that. So sort of a long-winded answer. I hope that's useful for you, and good luck getting started on that, because if you're at the beginning, it's a great place to be. There's a lot more tools out there than there were 20 years ago.
All right, great. And the next question is, how do you integrate unstructured data with structured data for analysis and reporting?
Good question. So the real key for this, and again I'll rephrase it in the preferred term, if you will, of how do we integrate tabular data with non-tabular data. And of course the first response to that is that you can't unless you know that something connects the piece of non-tabular data to the tabular data. So we'll just put me out there as a person ID. There's my smiley face on the screen there, and we'll assume that the government has done facial recognition so they can catch me as I walk into any airport and do anything as far as that goes. Now, if we were going to integrate some forms of non-tabular data in with that, we might in fact want to set it up so that when I walk into a establishment of some sort, maybe it's a restaurant, that it says to me, or maybe let's make it a hotel because I like this because I'll be traveling soon. So I walk into a hotel in India after traveling 20 hours to get there. And it would be great if their facial recognition was able to go to my structured information and pull up the fact that I'm staying at a Hyatt and that I happen to be a gold member at a Hyatt. I'm making this up, right? And say, oh, hey, Dr. Aiken, we're glad you're here. Here's your key. I can tell you're just off the airplane and you're tired and you just want to go to sleep, so we've got your room all ready for you and we've been expecting you. You know, that would be a lovely way to integrate that in there. And again, I'm telling you a what of an integration. Your next question is how. Well, is it based on facial recognition, or is it based on the fact that my passport has an RFID in it, or is it based on the fact that my iPhone can tell where I'm coming in, or is it based on the fact that I produce my gold Hyatt key, which I don't own, so I'm not saying that. But there's got to be something that connects these, and that's really an architecture function where you have architects in your organization working with your tabular and your non-tabular data to try and find hooks that allow you to determine these things seem to go together. That's really a big challenge for organizations, and if we could solve that problem easily, we would. Unfortunately, it's going to take some knowledge, skills, and abilities that we're in less current supply than we'd like to have right at the moment. And about the best we can come up with is to look at some existing examples where we have some people that have done some really phenomenal things around the area of identity management and keeping track of these things, and try to link them up at the technical levels so that we can maintain this sort of information. Again, maybe something from your Facebook page, maybe something from your Twitter feeds, et cetera, that you can pull this information in and take a look at this. And this does get us into some of the what we call big data technologies areas, where some of the more non-traditional processing can yield better results because we can have, again, a wider and more free-flowing type of analysis than we would have otherwise with this. Again, I was a little long-winded there, but I hope that helps out. If it's not, please ask another question.
Okay, the next question is, what tools do you find most useful in managing your own non-tabular data?
So it's a trick question, I'm sure. See if I can say this without sounding. I find I'm both my own best resource and at the same time my own worst enemy in the process. One of the things that Megan and I do, for example, after each of these webinars, is that we sit down and talk about packaging the information for all of you, all the listeners, so that you have a nice bite-sized chunk of information that occurs in one piece, so that we can deliver that to Shannon, and Shannon can get that out to everybody who signed up for the webinar. If I go a couple of days without talking to Megan about this, both of us have a lot of trouble sort of recreating the dialogue that we had around here. Now, when you asked what the best technology was, what I'm telling you is that the best technology is our wetware, where we know how to organize our own stuff. I know, for example, what order I keep things in, where things are on my hard disk. I've essentially had the same hard disk since 1994, literally, that I've been using all along on this. So I know where things are organized, and I can walk anybody through it, even if I couldn't see them. I know the organization of that disk because it's very well organized. So technologies can't really help you to organize things, but what they can do is help you to get organized. And the idea here is that if we go through and use what we're called data discovery, data profiling, data analysis tools, they will help you, first of all, identify the piles of data that you have, whether they are tabular or non-tabular, and organize those piles according to the roles that we described earlier in this seminar. Crucial, right, non-particularly crucial. Again, grading in some system to get us into that role-based document management strategy that we'd like to put in place. And if we have somebody who is good at organizing things, but they won't share that organizational process with other people, it is up to organizations to sit down and make that mandatory and say, I'm sorry, I know you're really smart, and you've got a really good way of doing this, but you need to share it with everybody else. So we can decide then which pieces of technology we want to put in place so that when you hit the lottery and retire early from this organization, we won't be stuck with not knowing how our data is organized. So, again, long story short, the most important piece of this is your own wetware, the people that you have, your domain experts, the subject matter experts that know how this is organized. Again, go back to my taxonomy of customers question. How should they be organized? Your sales and marketing groups are going to be very, very helpful at answering that particular piece. And only when you understand those requirements should you then turn around and try and look at one or more components of technology to see whether it's going to work. Again, I'm sure Microsoft would love to sell you a version of SharePoint, but if SharePoint isn't going to meet your needs, I wouldn't recommend buying it first. I would recommend getting your requirements, getting them understood, and then figuring out, because you'll have a much better discussion with the salespeople than you will if you just say, well, we've got to start organizing our enterprise content management. Salespeople love that because they got all sorts of things to sell you on.
Okay, great. And the next question is, where in the organization should records management be placed?
Great question. So those of you that have been following at least my recent writings know that I've come up with a book recently called The Case for the Chief Data Officer, where I say that the Chief Data Officer should be reporting to a business function. And I've taken the DAMA slide wheel here, and I'll flip back to it so that you can all see the thinking that's behind the process. And the short answer is the business, but let me just be very explicit about it. So here is our DAMA wheel, and on this wheel, everything in this wheel, with the exception of database operations and metadata management should be reporting into the business side. So in Peter's world, if Peter gets to advise your organization or your organization decides to listen to Peter, you would have a chief data officer reporting up through the business, not reporting up through IT, and that this document and content management would be a portion of that, because document, content, and records management is a business function. If it's treated as a technical function, you'll end up with a SharePoint site full of all sorts of rubbish or rot in there. Now, if you don't have a chief data officer on the business side reporting up to it, clearly it is a component that technology can manage but has done a historically poor job of managing. So what I would say is that if your organization wants to repeat the past by doing the same thing that most organizations do and expecting different results, it's an exercise in frustration, and that you really should have this reporting to a business function. Oh, and by the way, I should put a plug in too, Megan. We should grab that one earlier. We're doing a topic in March around data jobs, and probably this document and content component will address this with a couple of my colleagues who've been doing some thinking around this as well. So come back in 3 months and we'll tell you some more.
Very nice. All right. Well, the next question is, where would metadata management report?
Again, same thing here. Metadata management is a business function, and that while there are certain aspects of it that can be shared with IT, absolutely, it's making metadata. Gartner's definition of metadata is that metadata unlocks the value of organizations' data and therefore requires management attention. And, of course, I love that second clause in there, because we want management to be paying specific attention to metadata management. And right now it's been buried in IT and has not been able to get the traction because people don't see the direct business value that it has. So when we look at enterprise document and content management, metadata is a crucial part of that, and again, that should be reporting up through a business function, not through an IT function.
Alrighty, we need to hire an architect to help us with content management. What skills should we look for?
I would make sure that you have somebody that at least is familiar with the library science literature, because that is going to be the most helpful for you initially, and that you may want to look at growing that into a true manager beyond an architect type position eventually. But in addition to that, you've got to have good business analysis skills too. If you have somebody who is, again, forgive the phrase, very geeky and can't interact with the business won't interact with them, and they won't be able to understand the business needs, which means they won't be able to select the appropriate technology. You've heard me say all this already today in terms of that. So get a personable individual who is very interested in the business, but also has some technical skills. That would be one of our purple squirrels that we look for, right, Megan? Because there aren't very many of them around. But we do have a jobs board at dama.org, and you're welcome to post up there free of charge for looking for things. And again, going to your local DAMA meetings might be helpful as well.
Alrighty, it looks like that is all the questions we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's event. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks again to Dataversity and Shannon for hosting us. Once again, you will receive today's materials within the next 2 business days. Our webinar next month will be Demystifying Big Data. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. And as always, feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Peter, for another great presentation. And yeah, 3 years, Peter, so this is great. I just love it. And I'm working to get all the January and February webinars posted along with the rest of the year, so we'll get that fabulous lineup we've got going for you up as soon as possible. So I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks for attending, and thanks for all the great questions and interaction. I just love it when that happens. And enjoy the day and stay warm.
Happy holidays.
Cheers.
Bye.